Hi guys, so we're going to start today by talking about that reaction of photosynthesis. I told you how important this is going to be. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water with light in the chlorophyll will yield 1 molecule of a glucose sugar and 6 molecules of oxygen. If you were to read this in reverse, although it is not truly the reverse reaction, if you were to read this reaction in reverse, you would have the reaction for respiration. So the first stage of photosynthesis captures sunlight and transfers energy. If you remember, when we talked about photosynthesis, we could break down that word into 2 parts. Photo meaning light, synthesis meaning to make. A photosystem is where the photo part of photosynthesis is going to take place. It's a series of light-absorbing pigments and proteins that capture and transfer energy in the thylakoid membrane. These are the photo part, the light-dependent, requiring light part of the photosynthesis reaction. During the light-dependent reactions, chlorophyll and other light-absorbing molecules capture energy from the sunlight. Water molecules are broken down into hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen gas. Oxygen is going to be given off as a waste product because, much like carbon dioxide is to us, oxygen is toxic to plants in certain amounts. No sugar is made during this process, but we're going to be creating molecules that are needed to produce the sugar. The main function of the light-dependent reaction is to capture and transfer energy. The energy from the electrons is used to make molecules that act as energy carriers. For photosynthesis, your primary electron carrier is going to be NADPH. And I like to think that this P right here stands for photosynthesis. And you'll see why when we get into cellular respiration. We also have ATP that is an energy carrier. And these molecules go on to the opposite, the synthesis side of photosynthesis, where light is not needed. Photosystem 2 comes before photosystem 1. It's just because photosystem 1 was discovered first. So in photosystem 2, chlorophyll and other light-absorbing molecules in the thylakoid membrane absorb energy from sunlight. Photosystem 2 is here, and it's called P680, and that's going to absorb wavelengths around that P680 range. This would be photosystem 1, and that's P700, so it's going to absorb wavelengths around 700. The first thing that happens in photosystem 2 is that the energy is absorbed from sunlight. Chlorophyll and other light-absorbing molecules will absorb the energy from sunlight. The energy is transferred to electrons. High-energy electrons then leave the chlorophyll and enter the electron transport chain. This is a series of proteins that are embedded in the thylakoid membrane that are responsible for the production of ATP. After the energy is absorbed from sunlight, the water molecules get split. Water goes into photosynthesis. Water is broken down by a series of enzymes into oxygen, hydrogen, and electrons. Oxygen gets released as a waste product in the form of a gas. Electrons replace those that have left the chlorophyll when energy from the sun is absorbed, and they are passed to the electron transport chain. Then the hydrogen ions get transported. The electrons move from protein to protein inside the electron transport chain. Each time that the electrons move, they are forcing hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient to build up inside the thylakoid membrane. This is active transport because we're pushing them against their concentration gradient. This buildup of hydrogen ions becomes important when we start to make ATP. The electrons then move on to photosystem 1, which is that same process, but we're looking at different wavelengths of light. Light comes in and uses the electrons from photosystem 2 to capture sunlight and start a new process. The first thing that happens is that energy is absorbed from light. In photosystem 2, chlorophyll and other light-absorbing molecules inside of the thylakoid membrane absorb energy from sunlight. The electrons get energized and then leave the molecule, similarly with photosystem 2. Then NADPH gets produced. The energized electrons are added to a molecule called NADP+, forming a molecule called NADPH. NADP+ functions like a lower energied ADP, and NADPH functions like a higher energied ATP. The last part of the light-dependent reaction is the production of ATP. The production of ATP depends on the hydrogen ions that have been built up across the membrane that will now diffuse back through the membrane through passive transport in order to make ATP. The first thing that happens is those hydrogen ions begin to diffuse. They flow through the protein channel in the thylakoid membrane called ATP synthase. The difference of the hydrogen ion concentration is called a chemiosmotic gradient, and this stores potential energy. The ions flow through the channel by diffusion, passive transport now moving from high concentration to low concentration. The diffusion of hydrogen ions causes ATP production. The protein channel that is part of the complex is called ATP synthase. As the hydrogen ions move through the channel, ATP synthase makes ATP by adding a phosphate group to molecules of ADP. And you can think of ATP synthase like a revolving door. As someone goes through it, we're creating energy. Another one goes through it, we're creating more energy. ATP synthase is an enzyme that catalyzes the reaction to add high energy phosphate groups to make ATP. A summary of the light-dependent reactions. Energy is captured by sunlight, by light-absorbing molecules. The energy is transferred down the electron transport chain to pass the electrons from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. Water molecules get broken down into the hydrogen ions, the electrons, and the oxygen. The water provides the hydrogen ions to create the chemiosmotic gradient to make the molecules that will be needed in the light-independent reaction. The energized electrons have two different purposes. First is they provide the energy to the hydrogen ions for transport. Then they are added to NADP+ to make NADPH. Then the hydrogen ions flow through ATP synthase in order to make ATP. And the products of this reaction system, the light-dependent, is oxygen, which is given off as waste, NADPH, and ATP that are going to later be used to make the organic sugars. The second part of photosynthesis uses that energy created in the light-dependent reaction to make the sugars. These are the light-independent reactions. These can take place in the absence of light, and as long as there is an energy storage, they can work. These reactions take place at any time, as long as that energy is available. The energy needed for this series of chemical reactions is called the Calvin cycle, which is named after the scientist who discovered it. The Calvin cycle cannot take place unless ATP and NADPH are present from the light-dependent reactions. The chemical reactions of the Calvin cycle use carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere and the energy carried by our electron carriers to make simple sugars. This is our synthesis part of photosynthesis. meaning to make. This is the Calvin cycle. So it's a series of chemical reactions that use ATP to make ADP because we need energy in passing hydrogens along. And it's the process by which a photosynthetic organism uses energy to create simple sugars. The first thing that happens in the Calvin cycle is that oxygen or carbon dioxide gets added. There's a 5-carbon molecule already inside of the carbon cycle or inside the Calvin cycle. We take a 6th carbon from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to produce that 6-carbon molecule in the cycle. Then energy from ATP and NADPH come in and break the 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules and rearrange them. They're rearranged, and one of them will be high energy. That high energy 3-carbon molecule will exit the Calvin cycle. It doesn't go very far, but it stays outside of the Calvin cycle. The other one stays inside of the Calvin cycle. After 2 molecules of carbon dioxide have been added and 2 high energy 3-carbon molecules have been made, they are fused together to make a 6-carbon sugar, usually glucose. The 3-carbon molecules are recycled in the Calvin cycle. The energy from ATP molecules is used to rearrange the 3-carbon molecule again back into a 5-carbon molecule to stay in the Calvin cycle. So every time it turns, that molecule is there and ready to pick up more carbon dioxide. The summary of the light-independent reactions is that carbon dioxide enters the cycle. ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent reactions transfer energy to the Calvin cycle. 1 high-energy 3-carbon molecule is made for every 3 molecules of carbon dioxide. 2 high-energy 3-carbon molecules get bonded together to make a sugar. Therefore, it takes 6 molecules of carbon dioxide to be added to the Calvin cycle to make 1 sugar. The products are a 6-carbon sugar, NADP plus, and ADP, which are cycled back to the light-dependent reactions to keep this whole series going.